Hi, welcome back to Not an Audio Review channel where I don't review audio gear. Apologies if you hear some strange noises in the background. They're doing construction outside my window and apparently will be for the next 3 years or so. So that's nice for me and my sanity as I'm working from home. Now, my main audio system is at my desk in my home office where I basically have music on all day while I work. In the beginning, I plugged $40 headphones into the jack on my laptop and had a pair of Bluetooth speakers, and I was happy in my ignorance of high quality sound. Then I was cursed with audiophilia and bought a DAC, which I connected via USB. And sometime in a few DACs later, I wanted to improve the sound quality with a DDC, or digital to digital converter, which converted the USB to SPDIF. And then I got a better DDC, which converted the USB to I2S, and I got a USB isolator, and then I got a different USB isolator, and then I got some fancy expensive cables, and each one of these things made some, though often marginal, improvement to the sound. Then imagine my surprise when I took this $40 Raspberry Pi 4 that I originally got to make a NAS, or network attached storage, and I added this Hifiberry Digi Plus Pro SPDIF hat to it, and discovered that this $90 solution sounded better than my noisy ass computer outputting to this $70 isolator and this $500 DDC and these cables I don't want to tell you how much I paid for. And if you think cables don't make a difference, I made a whole episode about that you can watch, but none of that matters for this episode. I think I paid another $10 for this plastic case and $75 for the fancy iFi power supply, but it's still much cheaper than this DDC and sounds better. Like, it's not just that you have a darker background and more clarity, it's like it feels like that extra clarity gives the instruments a better sense of body and dimensionality. Honestly, the difference is remarkable. And it's not because USB is bad per se, as we'll talk about. It's because the computer is an incredible... It's hard dealing with props. It's because the computer is an incredibly noisy source that's just not delivering a clean signal. In fact, I'd argue just about any streamer is going to perform better than USB from a laptop or desktop computer just because the signal from a computer is that bad. At least, all the streamers I'm going to talk about in this video noticeably perform better, so that's been my experience. So I decided to keep upgrading because of course I did, I'm incorrigible. And I got this $250 Pi 2 Design Pi 2 AES 2.0 hat, which outputs I2S, among other things. And that was a meaningful improvement in quality over the Digi Plus Pro hat, and still much less money than the Matrix DDC. Now, in my living room, I wanted a streamer with HDMI ARC so I could connect it to my TV and use the TV remote to control the sound when watching TV. Whoopsie. And from what I understand, the Raspberry Pi is implemented in such a way that it can't support HDMI ARC. At least I've never seen a hat that supports it. So in my living room, I originally got this, the Bluesound Node 2021, which when I bought it was the least expensive thing I could find that would let me stream music that had HDMI ARC and a digital output, in this case SPDIF or USB, so I could connect it to an external DAC and get that improvement in sound quality, and also has a trigger output so I can turn my power amp on and off automatically. I bought this refurbished for $450. The main issue with it is that, perhaps because it's refurbished, there's some kind of defect where the SPDIF output just drops out sometimes randomly, which would force me to switch my Apple TV to stream to it with AirPlay every time I turned it on and it didn't work, which was very annoying, especially when you have a pair of children screaming for their favorite TV show. And this problem got worse as time went on. But a new player has came on the scene lately. So I recently replaced the Node with this Wiim Ultra, which I bought for $350. And so, since I have them both here, it's worth giving them a comparison. And then I threw another wild card into the mix. If you meet me over at camera 3, this is the EverSolo A10, a $4,000 streamer DAC that was lent to me by Andrew DiMarcangelo of Bloom Audio. Now, Andrew and I actually worked together many years ago at a company that has nothing to do with audio, and I was delighted when I discovered he'd opened up an audio retailer. And he's a really great guy, and Bloom is fantastic. So if you're in the market for some audio gear, don't buy it from Amazon. They don't care about audio, and they definitely don't care about you. Buy from Bloom Audio instead. This isn't an ad read, by the way. Andrew didn't give me any script and has no idea what I'm going to say. This is just me talking. Anyway, the reason I wanted the A10 here, besides, holy crap, he lent me a $4,000 streamer, was that I wanted to see how close these other, much less expensive streamers got to something that cost real money, and whether that price tag could possibly be worth it. Some notes about my setup and testing. For practical reasons, I can't really run an Ethernet cable in here, but I found that using this simple Wi-Fi repeater and an Ethernet cable gives me better reception than just running Wi-Fi from whatever streamer I'm using. I also added this iFi Ethernet filter to it for whatever it's worth, but the cable itself is a bog standard thing and not anything special. And I'm connecting it to my Parasound A23 Plus power amp and Q Acoustic Concept speakers. And I tried it with and without a headphone amp and preamp. In this case, mostly this whammy amp that I just built with Sparkos op amps and a number of upgrades, which I'll do a video about at some point, but it's been a lot of fun. And I also threw in my X10D clone tube buffer that I've talked about many times before, which I just upgraded with fancy Cryotone ECC88 tubes, which are sick, but that's also a topic for another time. And when I'm not using the internal DAC of the unit, the digital output is going to my PS Audio DirectStream Mark I, and I'll talk about the differences between using SPDIF, USB, or I2S to send those signals as we go. I also tried some of these streamers with a cheap DAC for comparison, in this case a Shitmodi Plus. Further, these comparisons were made primarily using the Qobuz streaming service. I was using Apple Music before I switched streamers, which I think has much better recommendation features. Qobuz doesn't even put their recommendation features like their MyQ playlist on their Mac app, which what's up with that? The problem with Apple Music is that the only way to play it on most streamers is through AirPlay. Now, AirPlay 1 was limited to 16-bit 14.4 Hz, which is CD quality, which means if you tried to play music at a higher resolution, it would get downsampled to 16.14.4 rather than streamed bit perfectly. Now, I'm not going to have the monkey come out and debate with me the audibility of these different resolutions. We've got a lot to get through today, but I just don't want my streaming service downsampling my music. And then Apple released AirPlay 2, which compounds the issue by often falling back to the lossy AAC codec, which is not even a particularly great lossy codec. They actually made AirPlay worse. Now, this may have something to do with the fact that unlike Qobuz, Tidal, or Spotify Connect, AirPlay can mirror not just Apple Music, but a whole system. So I can, for example, AirPlay all audio output from my Mac or iPhone and get YouTube, meetings, phone calls, or whatever seamlessly going through the streamer without having anything physically plugged into it, as long as they're both on the same local network. But that's part of the reason why AirPlay not being bit perfect is so frustrating, because if it were, it would be game-changing, at least for folks with Apple devices. Now, there's people theorizing that AirPlay 3, whenever it arrives, will support full lossless audio at all bit rates that Apple Music supports, which would, make sense and bring them into parity with Qobuz Connect and Tidal Connect. But until then, Apple is kneecapped on most streamers. Meanwhile, Spotify just released their long-awaited lossless audio tier, which limits everything to 16.14.4, even off your computer or phone. So, not very compelling compared to the competition, especially considering how long people have been waiting for it. And on top of that, Spotify still pays musicians worse than any other service, so screw them. I also have some FLAC files and even a handful of DSD files, but most of my listening these days is via streaming. And also, I'm going to talk about sonic differences between these units in broad strokes. I'm not going to go into minute things like there being slightly more zing to a hi-hat in one song or something. This isn't a review channel, and I have a lot to cover here, and the bottom line is more interesting than the specifics. And if you think all streamers sound the same, feel free to complain in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe while you're down there. Thanks. To begin with, the Wiim Ultra, which at $350 is sort of the hot new kid on the block, and for good reason. In terms of hardware features, this has most of the things you could want. It doesn't have balanced outputs, and unlike the A10, it can't store files and be used as a server. But unlike the A10, it does have a phono input, which is neat if you're into that kind of thing. I don't have a record player though, so I didn't test that at all. It also doesn't have any I2S output, but you don't really expect it on something consumer-oriented like this. And in place of that, it has HDMI ARC, which makes it suitable for my living room. And like the Node, you can do digital output through SPDIF and USB. The real star of the show here, though, besides the price, is the software, which in terms of usability is simply the best streamer software available as far as I know. The EverSolo A10 has some software features this software doesn't have, like convolution filters and whatnot. But like everything just works on here the way you'd expect without ever making you stop and get frustrated because you can't figure out how to do something, which is basically my baseline for how good an operating system UI is. Like there's these nice tabs that let you easily search tracks across streaming services or change your source inputs. It's just nice. And there's a full parametric EQ, built-in room correction, though how well that room correction does and does not work versus other room correction could be its own video, and I'm not going to get too deep into it. And when you do the room correction, it creates a PEQ profile for it so you can tweak it. And if I wanted to get my laptop and measurement mic and take a measurement and then create a PEQ profile based on that and put that into the Wiim, I could do that, though I'd have to manually input each band setting. So yeah, this is pretty great. And there's basically nothing that has these kinds of features in this price category that isn't made by Wiim. So how does it sound? Pretty good. The internal DAC is, let's just say it's perfectly acceptable. But honestly, you're going to do a lot better connecting an external DAC to this. Even something as inexpensive as the shit Modi, which I think sounds noticeably cleaner and clearer than the internal DAC on the Wiim, particularly using the USB output. This is the Modi Plus, which I bought new for $120, but Shit just introduced their new Shit Modi 5 for $150, which has their new mesh technology that's supposed to be amazing. I haven't tried it, but given the reviews of its mesh big brother, the $300 Mimir, has gotten, I would bet money that the Modi 5 smokes the DAC in here and the one in the Node, which we'll talk about. In any case, this Modi Plus I think is better than both of them as well. And it's important to note that the difference between connecting a DAC through SPDIF or USB is primarily that if you use SPDIF, you're using the clock inside the streamer to keep all those thousands and thousands of samples precisely aligned, whereas with USB, you're using the clock in your DAC. So which one performs better can be dependent on how good the clock in your DAC is compared to your streamer. And so SPDIF from the Ultra to my direct stream DAC, for example, doesn't sound nearly as good as USB because the clock in the direct stream is dramatically better. And I think the clock in the Modi is better as well. Now, one person I know said they thought the $220 Wiim Pro Plus actually sounds better than the Wiim Ultra once you add a quality linear power supply to it. Unlike the Wiim Pro Plus, the Ultra has the power supply built in, so you can't easily change it. I haven't tried it, so I can't confirm, and the Wiim Pro Plus doesn't have HDMI ARC or USB output, but if you don't need that or the other features of the Ultra, the Pro Plus seems like a pretty compelling device. Moving on to the Bluesound Node 2021 edition. Now, as I mentioned, this unit has some issues with SPDIF output, but I'm going to assume that this is specific to this refurbished unit and not typical. The USB, HDMI ARC, and internal DAC functionality all work fine though. The DAC in the Node 2021, well, it isn't very good. Certainly not as good as the Wiim Ultra, sounding less refined and detailed. Now, Bluesound seems to have understood this, and they put a much better DAC into the current version of the Node that replaced this model and retails for $700. But like the Wiim, the output from the USB to my direct stream DAC sounds meaningfully better than the SPDIF on the Node when I can get the SPDIF to work. However, using the Node as a streamer into my DAC through both SPDIF and USB sounds not as good to me as the Ultra. In both cases, the Node seems darker, more restrained, less dynamic. Honestly, the Node 2021 sounds kind of dull to me in comparison to the Wiim Ultra and not better. Though maybe if your sister was on the bright and harsh side, this could calm that down a little. The direct stream DAC is basically the opposite of an overly bright and harsh DAC, so maybe this is a case of bad synergy. But I honestly preferred the Modi on the Ultra better than the Node 2. Now, a British audiophile said he thought the new $380 Node Nano sounded better as a standalone streamer than the Wiim Ultra, and even better than the $800 EverSolo A6. And I haven't tried that, so maybe it's true, or again, maybe there's synergy at play. And because unlike the Node 2021, the Node Nano uses an external power supply, you have the ability to upgrade it with a better one, so that's nice. And like the Node, but unlike the Wiim Pro Plus, the Node Nano has USB output, so you can use the clock in your DAC. But where the Node pales in comparison to the Ultra is in features. With the hardware, the Node doesn't have an LCD screen, and you can see, just looking at the back panels, how many more things the Ultra can do by comparison. And then there's the software, which isn't nearly as intuitive as the Wiim's. Like, look at this. Why is there a box that says HDMI ARC with a play button? Tell me you don't have to take a second to figure out what that means. That's what an intuitive interface is, right? It's an interface where you don't have to think about or guess what it does. It just works in the way you expect it to. And basically, the whole thing is like this. Trying to figure out how to do something like change the inputs just takes a lot of guessing about where to tap in a way it just doesn't on the Wiim. And the app often leaves you tapping around and looking for things or Googling how to do them. And as for the software features, well, this is all the EQ you get on the Node. Treble, bass, like it's offering you the tone knobs on an integrated amp from the 1970s. Compare this to the full parametric EQ on the Ultra. There's no out-of-the-box room correction, though you can use Dirac with it, and Dirac is supposed to be one of the best room correction suites around, but it costs $159 to $250 on top of the cost of the Node. For all these reasons, it feels like Bluesound really needs to up its game if it wants to be competitive with the Wiim, because right now it's hard for me to imagine why you'd pay $800 for a Node rather than paying $350 for a Wiim and $150 for a shit Modi 5 and have $300 left over and maybe better sound and definitely more features. Before we move on to the Pi streamer, which is going to take more time, let's talk about this Eversolo DMP A10. Now, I'd love to tell you that any of these less expensive solutions outperform the big daddy here, but come on. No, they don't. The real question here isn't whether this is better. It's just how much better, and whether or not that makes it worth an eye-popping $4,000. In terms of hardware, this is everything the Wiim Ultra has except for the phono input, and adds a few extra things. It has not one but two subwoofer outputs for stuff like my living room, where I have a subwoofer for each channel, which is nice. And in addition to being able to high pass and low pass the preamp and sub outputs, which the Ultra and Node can also do, the A10 can delay the signal to the subwoofers, which can be useful if you have your subs far away from your speakers, and is a feature I don't think I've seen anywhere else. It has a fiber optic port, which in theory can be better than Ethernet for your data connection, though I don't have the stuff to try that out myself. It has not just USB output, but isolated USB, so you don't need to add an isolator like this one. This is the JDS Labs Synapse. It's pretty good and not very expensive. And it has a bunch more inputs and outputs and so forth you can see on the back panel, including HDMI ARC, but not I2S. In addition, it has bays for SSDs, so you can use it as a music server. You can also plug USB into it and output SPDIF or optical to use it as a DDC. And of course, unlike the Node and the Ultra, the internal DAC has balanced as well as single-ended inputs and outputs. It can act as a digital preamp if you're just sending the digital signal to a separate DAC, or an analog preamp if you're using the internal DAC or the analog inputs that it also has to make it a pure analog preamp for you vinyl nerds or whatever. And for the analog preamp, it engages this fancy clicky stepped attenuator, click, 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 which is supposed to have superior channel matching than the mere potentiometers of most volume controls. Plus it's got this crazy LCD screen inset in the volume knob. My poor Whammy's Alps Blue Velvet Pod is getting whatever the preamp equivalent of penis envy is. Really, the only thing you don't have here is a headphone jack, which stands out since the Wiim and the Node both have headphone jacks, even if they aren't particularly great. Even the Pi has a headphone jack right there. But that one is god-awful. Just don't do it. No, don't do it. Of course, since the Whammy is DIY, I could actually put a fancy stepped attenuator in there, but it would cost like half the total cost of the Whammy kit. And I'm not even sure it would fit in the chassis. As for the software, well, it's not quite as intuitive as the Wiim, but it's easily second best, and it gives you a lot more features. So yes, we have parametric EQ and room correction out of the box, and it's not just EQ-based room correction like the Wiim, it actually uses fancy convolution filters like Dirac does, though I haven't tried Dirac, so I can't tell you how it compares. And while the Wiim requires you to manually input whatever measurements you took in REW if you do things that way, with the EverSolo, you can create a profile in REW with convolution filters and then import them directly into the unit. which is wild. And you can set different EQ settings for different inputs and outputs. And there's a dang loudness button and optional compression. And like, this thing is sick. And of course, you have AirPlay, Qobuz Connect, Tidal Connect, and so on, just like the Ultra and the Node. But the EverSolo also has an extra trick up its sleeve. Because this operating system is based on Android, it can actually run the Android version of the Apple Music app as found in the Google Play Store, which means it can run actual, for real, totally lossless Apple Music. Unlike the also Android-based Fio R7, it can't run any app from the Play Store, only the ones EverSolo allows, which is good or bad depending on your perspective. Now, from a UI point of view, this isn't nearly as good as AirPlay. I can't just open the Apple Music app on my computer or phone and click and it'll play whatever I want on the streamer. To use this lossless Apple Music option, I have to use either the A10's touchscreen or the EverSolo app on my phone, which lets me mirror the touchscreen. And this introduces something confusing and unintuitive in the EverSolo OS, because there's basically two Apple Music apps, one for AirPlay and one without. And you just have to kind of know that and understand the difference. And while I can load the EverSolo app into my Mac using the Mac's ability to run iOS apps, because it's an iOS app, it also doesn't link in with the computer's capabilities. Meaning, as we'll talk about later with LMS, the play pause buttons on my computer keyboard don't work. The main thing that makes this not as bad as it could be is that the big screen of the A10 is right at my elbow, so I can play and pause from there, but it's not ideal. I wish EverSolo would make a proper Mac app. Anyway, the thing is, most of these features can already be found on the lower priced EverSolo offerings. So the A6 doesn't have the FIR convolution filters, the A8 adds I2S output, but like the A6, gives up the subwoofer and fiber optic ports, and the T8, which is a network transport, has I2S, but gives up HDMI ARC, and of course, doesn't have a DAC or analog preamp. The thing that in theory makes the A10 really stand out from these less expensive options should be the sound quality. And while I can't compare it to the other EverSolo devices because I haven't heard them, I can compare it to what I have. The big problem for me with the price of this unit is frankly the internal DAC. Now, it's a very good DAC. It's obviously better than the DACs inside the Ultra or the Node, and in fact sounds like an excellent ESS implementation and certainly doesn't have any of the glare or other issues that I associate with low-end ESS DACs, though not the Modi Plus, which sounds pretty good, but not as good as this. Another problem with some ESS implementations is I find they can be so smooth they can sound glassy and over smooth, particularly depending on the gear you pair them with, which is the opposite of what I find with AKM DACs, where they can sound too rough and textured for my tastes. And also, they can set off an itchiness that's hard to describe in me that I don't think most people experience. But I talked about that in this other video about the Pecan Pi streamers. Anyway, this still has what I think of as an ESS sound. It's not itchy, but it's not glassy or glary. It's a good amount of smooth while still sounding organic and natural, if maybe a little more tipped up in the treble than I usually prefer. So what's the problem? Well, the problem, as Darko pointed out in his review of the A10, is you can get the EverSolo T8 streamer transport for $1,400, which has most of the same features minus the DAC and analog preamp, and you'd have another $2,600 left over for a separate DAC. And there's just a lot of amazing DACs you can get for that kind of money. I mean, my DirectStream Mark I DAC originally cost $6,000, but because it's old and has been replaced in the PS Audio lineup twice over, you can find it on the used market for $1,500 or less, with the usual caveats about used gear not having warranties or support and so forth. And in my opinion, the DirectStream is a dramatically better DAC than what's in the A10. Now, I made a whole other video about the DirectStream, and it might not be everyone's cup of tea, but for that kind of money, there's just many, many DACs that I honestly think would outclass what you have here, good as it is. I mean, you could even get the T8 and EverSolo's own flagship Z10 DAC for $600 less than the A10, and that will even get you a headphone jack. As a streaming transport to my DirectStream DAC, the A10 does sound phenomenal though, and compared to the Ultra and the Node, the background is just blacker and clearer and things are more detailed. It already sounded better than any streamer had sounded in my system with the coax output that used the internal clock of the A10. But when I switched to USB so that I used the DirectStream clocks, it sounded better again, clearer and more dynamic. But that's going to depend on the DAC you pair it with. So what about the Raspberry Pi streamer? You'd think, since the USB output uses the clocks of the DAC and my direct stream has great clocks, that I could just run a USB cable from the ports on the Pi without any hat at all, maybe throw on the USB isolator, and then I'm done. $40 streamer solution, max quality. Well, $100 with the isolator. But it just isn't the case. It sounded kind of awful, honestly. Even adding the Matrix GDC didn't help that much. The sound was rough and gritty and unpleasant. And I think I've learned pretty clearly with this and the USB outputs of the Ultra and the Node that there's just more to the sound of a streamer than the clocks. I don't know what it is, but the USB out from the A10 sounds better than any of the others, and the USB output from the built-in Pi sounds dramatically worse. Meanwhile, the SPDIF output of the Pi with the Digi Plus Pro hat and the i5 power supply sounds honestly at least as good as the SPDIF output of the Ultra and the Node for less than $200. And then adding the Pi 2 AES hat with its I2S output sounds significantly better. In terms of clocks, I2S is funny because it can use the streamer's clock unless the DAC doesn't want it to, in which case it can reclock everything with its own clock, which is what the direct stream DAC does. With I2S, you're always using the direct stream's clock. And I2S is a port that PS Audio pioneered, so their I2S implementation is particularly good. And so, based on my experience here, for less than $400 for pure sound quality as a streamer transport alone, this Pi configuration absolutely creams both the Ultra and the Node 2021. And you can even juice the performance a bit more by using separate power supplies for both the Pi and the hat, which just requires you to move a jumper. In fact, while this definitely isn't as good as the A10 through its SPDIF or USB outputs, it gets shockingly close for a fraction of the price. Like, switching between the Pi and the A10, it gets better, tighter, cleaner, blacker background, yes, but it's not nearly as big a difference as you'd expect. Now, the Pi 2 AES hat has actually been deprecated by its manufacturer, Pi 2 Design, and replaced by the Mercury Mini Streamer, which has a proper chassis and better power filtering and some other improvements. And that costs $300, though you might want to upgrade the power supply, and it'll pretty surely sound even better than this. And if you really had a mind to, there's all kinds of things you could do to juice the Pi. There's in Canada boards with upgraded clocks or terrifying supercapacitor power supplies and other things. Or you can get a second Pi and run Doretta, which is supposed to be phenomenal, and so on. Though I didn't do it, I absolutely believe that if you put some effort into it, you can make a Pi that sounds better than the A10 for a lot less money. In fact, if sound quality were the only question, I could probably live with the Pi 2 AES solution and be done because it's that good. The problem with the Raspberry Pi as a streamer is the software, which is terrible. So, to clarify, there's a number of different free operating systems that you can install on a Pi, and it's great that it's free and you have options. But right off, it does give you a bit more effort than the regular streamers because you have to burn an OS onto an SD card and then load it into the Pi. Though if you buy something like the Mercury Mini, you can get it with the OS already installed. For audio streamer software for the Pi, the major players are PiCore Player, Mood, Ropi, and Volumio. All of them except for PiCore Player support AirPlay and Roon, and all of them, including PiCore Player, support something called LMS, which I'll talk about in a bit. Ropi even has a checkbox to force AirPlay 1 so that you can actually get the lossless AirPlay that Apple took away from AirPlay 2. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on Volumio, which has the most features and is the only way to get Qobuz Connect on the Pi currently. But feel free to tell me why your favorite OS is better in the comments. Volumio has a free tier that allows you to loan your own files off whatever storage you have connected to the Pi to use as a server and use AirPlay and LMS and some other things. It also has free plugins, including one for full parametric EQ, though the interface feels a couple decades out of date, but it's there and it works, so I'll take it over BlueOS, which doesn't have it at all. And there's also a way to load convolution filters off of REW into it, just like the EverSolo can do. LMS stands for Lyrion Media Server, and it is an open source streamer and music server platform, which has clients called Squeezelight clients, and these names have a historical basis because this started life as Logitech Media Server until Logitech stopped producing devices running it and supporting it, and then to their credit, open sourced it so the original developers and others could keep it going. To use LMS, you need a computer set up as a server, which can actually also be the client streamer, but for me, I'm using my Mac. You can then load the interface for LMS into your web browser as a site running on your local network. And LMS has a lot going for it. It's free, for one, and it has a large library of plugins, including its own PEQ. There's a bug where you turn on the EQ and leave the page and then go back, and it says the EQ is off even though it's still on, so that's confusing. It also has its own Qobuz and Tidal support, but importantly, this isn't support for Qobuz or Tidal Connect, meaning you can't control the music from your Qobuz or Tidal app. You have to use the LMS web browser interface on your computer or phone, but the app on your phone is basically just a container for the website. To access your Qobuz or Tidal library, you don't get a lot of the features that are in the apps for those things, like all the Qobuz Discover tab and magazine stuff. And the LMS interface isn't very good. It's terrible, actually. Everything takes too many clicks to do. A lot of things like searches and play cues don't work the way you expect them to. And even with the various themes available, the whole thing looks like something out of 2012, which is probably because that's when Logitech open sourced it. And particularly damning for me personally, because it runs out of a web app, the controls on my computer don't work with it, so I can't play, pause, or skip tracks forward and back by hitting the F keys like I normally would. And all of this, plus figuring out how to set up a server and a client and what that means, are the kind of things that would send your average user running for the hills. I suppose I could get a touchscreen for this and use it at my elbow like the EverSolo, but still suboptimal. Volumio also supports UPnP, which allows you to use Qobuz through the mConnect app on iOS and Android, which also sucks. Volumio, though, separate from LMS and UPnP, does support actual, for real Qobuz Connect and Tidal Connect that you can control from your Qobuz or Tidal app the way you actually want to use Qobuz and Tidal. The problem is that to use them, you have to pay for Volumio Premium, which costs $8.50 a month. And even after I started paying for it, I had some trouble getting it to work and contacted Volumio support, who weren't helpful. But then some folks on the Volumio forum were helpful in getting stuff working for me, but it took a few extra steps. And this is a far cry from the experience of the Wiim Node or A10, where I basically just plug them in and they immediately show up in Qobuz as an option. There is, of course, another option as well, Roon. The problem with Roon is that it's absolutely fantastic. Easily the best user experience for streaming software other than Wiim, and with far, far more features than Wiim, just an absolutely staggering number of features to shame even EverSolo, including integration to every imaginable room correction thing, convolution filters, upsampling, resampling, headphone auto EQ, support for HQ player, NAA oversampling, and on and on. It's frankly magnificent. The issue, of course, is that it's very expensive, $15 a month or a flat fee of $800, though at least they do offer a flat fee option, unlike Volumio, whose monthly fee will add up to more than Roon's flat fee in about 7.8 years, barring price increases. The other issue, and maybe a bigger one, is that I heard a degradation in sound quality when using Roon, and I can't quite explain it, but other people have reported the same, even though Roon says it's delivering bit-perfect sound. But the sound is just fuzzier and less clear using Roon. Roon requires you to have a server like LMS, but it's got to be beefier than a Pi, so I also set that up on my Mac. And so this may be because of the limitations of my MacBook, especially while I'm using it for other things while music is playing. I don't really know. But this sound quality hit was kind of shocking, and I experienced something similar using the less expensive Roon alternative Outervana, which is $7 a month or a flat fee of $150, and which I also had problems getting to work right, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about in a video that's already much too long. And so if I want to use Tidal Connect on my Pi and Pi 2 AES2 streamer, I'm kind of stuck paying a monthly fee, at least until AirPlay 3 actually supporting lossless playback comes out, or there's some other change in policy or features. And it's a shame because of how good the Pi with the Pi 2 AES hat sounds. Now, there's some other options, and feel free to tell me your favorites in the comments. Volumio has some of its own streamers and streamer DACs, and if you buy one of them, you get Volumio Premium for free and don't have the monthly fee. A British audiophile said he thought the $1,200 Revo streamer sounded even better than the more expensive EverSolo T8, and maybe it does. But honestly, personally, I have trouble swallowing the idea of paying that much money and getting software this, shall we say, in need of improvement. There's also stuff like the Holo Red, which costs about $1,000. This, like the Mercury Mini, uses a Raspberry Pi at its core, but it has some optimizations and improvements to its power supply and digital output that are supposed to improve sound quality. And it can also act as a DDC, so you have to reboot it to switch from streamer to DDC mode, making it less useful for that dual function than something like the A10, which can switch with a button on a remote. But the Red has gotten a lot of rave reviews and runs its own proprietary Red OS software, so you don't have to pay a monthly fee to get Qobuz Connect. But as far as I can tell, Red OS has no other features beyond supporting streaming services and protocols, so you don't get stuff like parametric EQ or other niceties. Now, I haven't heard the Red, though maybe I will soon. Don't forget to subscribe and find out. So I don't know how it sounds or whether or not it sounds better than the T8, which I also haven't heard. But certainly, if you don't need the features, the Red seems like a good option. And there are, of course, much more expensive streamers, and maybe they improve sound quality, but often, like the Holo Red, they have no other features. Now, this situation could change as other companies up their game, particularly Bluesound, which better be seeing Wiim and EverSolo as a jolt in the pants if they want to survive. But right now, if you want something that just works, has great features, doesn't cost a fortune, and sounds pretty good, get a Wiim, preferably with a separate DAC and maybe a USB isolator. If you don't need the extra features I've talked about, and you don't need HDMI ARC, and are willing to do some work in order to save money and have nearly infinite customization, get a Pi. Or if you just care about sound quality, get a Holo Red probably, or something like it. But as it stands now, if you want really great sound quality, an intuitive and easy to use operating system, plus Qobuz and Tidal Connect out of the box, lossless Apple Music, PEQ, room correction, convolution filters, SSD bays to act as a server, DDC functionality, isolated USB, an LCD touchscreen, and on, there's literally nothing on the market that has all of that and isn't made by Eversolo. And I'd gotten all the way to the end of this process and written a draft of this video, and I decided to still keep the Pi. I'm even working on my own dual power supply for it that I hoped would be ready for this video, but instead it exploded because sometimes that happens when you have no idea what you're doing. I even already ordered some parts to fix it. And I really love all this DIY stuff. I love the idea of maxing out a Pi and making it sound like a much more expensive streamer. But I was sitting here thinking, I'm going to have Apple Music no matter what because it comes with my Apple One subscription, and it doesn't make sense to cancel that because Apple One costs the same as the other individual services you get with it without Apple Music. So it's like I'm getting Apple Music for free. I'm really only using Qobuz because I can't get lossless Apple Music on streamers. Except, that is, for EverSolo streamers, which have the workaround. On top of that, I'm paying for Volumio Premium so I can stream Qobuz to my streamer, which means if I got the EverSolo T8 and canceled Qobuz and Volumio Premium, I would save $19.50 a month, which means the T8 would pay for itself inside of 4 years. And with that, I would get a device with all the features I mentioned and the second most usable operating system in the streamer world. And that's pretty compelling. This is how these sorts of monthly subscriptions could absolutely warp cost-benefit analyses. So I ordered the T8. It's coming soon, and when it does, I'll do another video where I'll put it head-to-head with the A10, the Pi Streamer, the Wiim, and the Node, and we'll see what's really worth the money and what comes out on top. Subscribe to find out how that goes. Bye now.